Chapin Hill Advisors. And first of all, I want to thank all of you for coming on today. This has been a very difficult, very stressful period for so many people. My firm does succession planning for family-owned businesses. It's a combination of personal planning, estate planning, succession planning, business planning, and often I happen to have a marketing brain, so very often I can bring marketing ideas. And, you know, one after another, I've seen people just terrified to spend the money. They're frozen. They just don't know how to go forward. Again, a lot of mine are in food and beverage, so caterers, food distribution companies, diners, spice companies, so a very wide variety of those. I also do a lot in the pet business. I'm a passionate animal rescuer, anybody who knows me. So, so this is the first of many webinars that we're going to be doing. So I'm very grateful to Chris Martin and Jason Putter today. I'm going to introduce them in 1 second. We'll be doing a series of different webinars on topics that we find are of interest and urgent. So we're going to have one first on real estate. The Moody's has estimated as many as 30% of households will default on their mortgages. So if you haven't refinanced, what are your chances of refinancing, et cetera? What's the state of personal residential real estate if you're trying to sell? And then we have the state of the multifamily market. So we're going to be doing that probably next week. I have a meeting tomorrow to firm that up. So look for those. We'll be sending them out via our mailing list. If you're not on my mailing list and you found this on social media, please feel free to shoot me an email to add you to the list, and I'm happy to add you to the list. So today we're going to get started with, I've heard so much information overload on this PPP and the stimulus program. A lot of the CARES Act programs that I've been on are just overwhelming with every piece of detail, from the personal employee piece to, you know, whether you're getting a $1,200 to the, you know, if you're a real estate business, charitable deduction. So we're going to stay very focused today really on the loan program, what's the status, and what to do if you've already applied and you're not sure where you stand. And most importantly, if you do get this stimulus, the PPP, how do you make sure it's forgivable? So I'm going to start with Chris Martin. I'm going to read, Chris will start first with a little bio on him and tell you why I have 2 attorneys giving this rather than CPAs. So Chris Martin has been, as young as he looks, he's been providing legal assistance for more than 30 years. So he's a business lawyer, so he does business and legal advice to growth companies and their key participants, which are generally founders, investors, and the senior executive. Prior to founding Martin LLP, Chris was with a large international law firm. He's also a certified public accountant as well, and he practiced with 2 of what were the big 4, PricewaterhouseCoopers and Ernst & Young. So Chris, I'm going to let you start and tell us, first of all, about Martin, what you do, and why you've become experts in this area. Take it away.
Sure. Yeah, so we have a firm of 12 lawyers, all of whom are out of large New York law firms. And our focus is really on lower middle market companies, privately held businesses. And so we represent a lot of entrepreneurs from early stage startups to, you know, later stage growth companies that you know, have built up and brought in outside investors. So that's what we focus on as a firm. And primarily in corporate, we also have litigation and real estate that supports our corporate practice. So, you know, almost every single one of our clients has been able to or should apply for the PPP loan program.
So you're in Stamford, Connecticut.
Yeah.
Martin LLP is the name of the firm. And you also do represent some financial institutions, correct? So you want to just give us a little bit of your view there of the world?
Sure. Yeah, we represent a number of banks in their debt finance work, and actually a number of banks that are involved in providing the PPP loans. So we've had a look both from the borrower's perspective and the bank's perspective in this market.
Folks, I'm going to be taking questions, so you can put questions at any point into the chat. And after Chris is finished with his first piece, if there's any questions, I'll repeat them and throw them out to him. So Chris, let's start with the overall status. What have you been hearing from the banks on the status of the processing and approval of the PPP loans?
We've certainly had clients that have received the loans. And so, if you go through the technical process, when you submit the paperwork to the bank, that's not a submission. The bank now has to submit it to the SBA. And when they submit it, it immediately gets accepted, and you get an acceptance number. Once you get that acceptance number, other than them doing a review on your financials to make sure that everything you applied for is correct, that is an approval. So once your bank has submitted it and received a number, you should be approved, and then the banks have to go through and process that, and they have to ramp up tremendously. And oddly enough, and this is just anecdotal evidence, what we're seeing from our clients is that the clients that have gone to the big banks are really subject to a much longer wait than the smaller banks are. And I think the smaller banks just have a lot less customers, and also the smaller businesses are the center of those smaller banks rather than the bigger banks, them not being the center of it. So we've heard some horror stories with some of the large banks. I won't say any names here, but we've had some really good luck with some of the smaller banks that are, and it really was recommended, not required, but recommended that you go to the bank you have your relationship with, rather than trying to go to a new bank that you don't have a relationship with. And we've seen that work for the most part.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things I saw with the lack of confusion, because in the paper, what you were reading was Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, the big guys, right? And just so this is public information, Wilbur Frost from CNBC reported the first week of the loan program, Bank of America had 177,000 applications. And in that first week, they'd only processed 100 to funding. So I think, this whole thing, again, many times when a government launches something, they don't really give thought to the granularity of this. A lot of the loan brokers are really doing triage on their loans right now, and they're figuring out whether or not they can work them out, do interest only, give a little loosening of covenants, et cetera. So to then add a brand new program on top of that is difficult. So Chris, let's talk about SBA made the announcement last Thursday. It's closed. So what happens if you're in and you haven't heard anything?
Well, I mean, you may have seen over the weekend, they're trying to negotiate a supplemental package. It is widely believed that it will get approved, and that everyone that has made an application that's appropriate should be able to be included with the new legislation that's going through Congress right now and expected to be agreed to and signed within the next few days. So while we do know companies that didn't get in and they were with large banks, they're very much expecting and have been told that they will get processed. So if anybody hasn't made an application and has a relationship with a smaller bank, that's a better pathway.
So if you haven't already applied, then definitely go to a smaller bank, even if you don't have a relationship, and all of us can make introductions.
Well, hopefully if you have a relationship. A lot of people have relationships with more than one bank. So it's just, I would skew it towards a smaller bank that will have more ability to pay attention to the smaller clients.
Right, but even if you haven't got a relationship, it's fine to start one along this way. And Chris, Jason, Will, myself can all make recommendations for local bankers in Connecticut and into Westchester. I happen to have a very large circle, so I can even go down and see. So if you need help, feel free to reach out to us. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jason. I'm going to introduce Jason Putter. Jason concentrates his practice on corporate and commercial transactions, including mergers and acquisition, debt financing, private equity, corporate finance on behalf of middle market clients, including a substantial number of growth companies with entrepreneurs who lead them. So let me just find Jason on my list. Here, and let me pin you so you're going to come into the big screen. There we go. Okay, Mr. Putter, let's talk about forgiveness. How critical is that? Let's start off with the simple formula. How is forgiveness of this loan? Because ideally, free money is better than money that costs anything at all, correct?
Exactly correct.
So let's talk about how what constitutes payroll costs and how is it calculated?
Right. Okay. So what we're going to look at here is consistent with its namesake, right? It's the Paycheck Protection Program. So the great majority of what's going to be forgivable will be the payments to your employees. So there's a relatively simple formula that you need to consider. What we're going to look at is the 8-week period following the disbursement of the loan. So you apply for the loan, you're approved, you get the loan, the proceeds are now in your bank, and you're going to fund for the next 8-week your payroll related costs. So what you want to look at there is at a minimum, 75% is going to have to be for payroll costs. That's a defined term in the CARES Act. And that is exactly what you would think. It's the payroll on account of payments to your employees. That's basically salary and wages and some tax items. The other 25% can be used for non-payroll costs. And the majority of baskets you have there are for utilities, for interest on mortgage payment, and rent. Now, it's really important to sort of highlight that in terms of forgiveness, as per Kathy's question, is to make sure that at least 75% of your loan is going towards the defined term payroll costs. That is a little inconsistent with the original act. So there's some original literature out there that's a little confusing that would suggest that you could use that disbursement as you see fit. Just do make sure you're paying at least 75% towards payroll costs specifically, and then that remainder 25% for non-payroll. And to the extent that you want to go more than 75% on payroll specific, that's fine too.
Okay, so let's talk about a situation like Jennifer Cook. She has a wellness center. Obviously, nobody's doing any massages, facials, etc. So if she's already laid off staff, what happens then in terms of loan forgiveness?
So what the program contemplates is that you will use the funds to rehire those employees. So what we're going to look at is the calculation of 100% forgiveness and then on down. So when you do your original application, which most folks have done already or in the process of doing, what you would have indicated is your historical headcount for your payroll based on the appropriate window, depending on if you're a new business or an existing business. Now, you'll then have the 8-week period post-disbursement where you'll have your current headcount, and the hope would be that your current headcount will either catch up to your historical headcount, meaning you've rehired those employees you've laid off, such that the headcount pre-PPP loan and post-PPP loan is the same. So in terms of forgiveness, to the extent they're the same, using the example of 10 employees, if you had 10 employees prior to the disbursement of the loan and you had 10 employees following the disbursement of the loan, well, then you're looking at 100% forgiveness. Now, if you had only rehired 8 out of those 10 employees, you're looking at 80% forgiveness because it's going to look at that calculus dollar for dollar.
And another thing to bear in mind with that is that, if you rehire the employees, that's what they want. But if you're rehiring employees who are not going to be able to perform a function and create value, then you wouldn't get loan forgiveness. You'd still get the loan, and you'd have to pay it back starting in 6 months with interest at 1% for over a period of 2 years. So there's some companies that are saying, hey, look, I could bring this person back in. There wouldn't be anything for them to do. I get the loan forgiveness. And so, yeah, it may be benefiting that person. But if I just didn't rehire that person, they can collect unemployment, and I can use those funds for the next 2 years for the rest of my business. So there is some tension and some individual or some companies that are saying, I'm not going to rehire people that are not going to be able to perform any services because those funds I could use for other purposes. You're not required, for instance, you're not required to use those funds just for payroll and rent and utilities. They can be used generally for your business. The forgiveness is completely separate from the loan. And so you have to look at that. Obviously you want to use the funds for business purposes, but if it's not a good use of funds to use it for payroll, to rehire people that are not going to do anything, then there's a lot of businesses that are saying, we're just not going to rehire and we're going to have to repay that money in 2 years.
So then it's 2 years, and is that the 1% interest rate with the amortization, or is that a different program?
No, it's a 1% interest rate. 2 years starting after the 6 month period after the loan.
So what you're saying is that, let's just say arbitrarily, I have $100,000, and let's just say 50,000 of it, I was able to meet the requirements, 75% payroll, 25% non-payroll but business-related expenses. The other 50,000 was spent on rent and everything else not payroll related. So 50% of it's forgivable, and 50% of it is then tied to the 1%.
Right. And you also don't have to spend all of it by the end of that 8-week period. It's generally meant to help the business over potentially a longer period, but they're just coming up with a very, sort of succinct way of looking at the forgiveness. And obviously the government's goal is to get you to rehire everyone. But that, you have to think from a business perspective, is that the best thing? And when you look at it in conjunction with the federal supplement for unemployment, for instance, if somebody is making $50,000 a year, with the normal state unemployment in, say, Connecticut, New York, and the federal supplement, they could be making as much on unemployment as they'd be making working for you. So there's a little bit of more of a calculus that goes into, what's the best thing to do. You obviously want to do best for your employees, but if they're going to be financially in the same position, you can just maybe furlough them for a bit longer until the economy gets back into action, and then use those funds to pay them once you get back up and running. It wouldn't qualify for forgiveness, but you still, you're funding your business.
Okay, so I want to come back to you because I think that this is really pressing. I have one particular pending client. They were with one of the large banks. They filed the first weekend, actually. I can't believe that. But then the bank came back to them it's only been out for 3 weeks. So the bank came out to them 1.5 weeks in, and they had to resubmit their application and refile last week. So do they, in that case, if the bank comes back to you and says, oh, we didn't fill this out correctly, do we lose our place in line? Or, how do we know whether or not we're going to get this money is, I think, what a lot of people are asking.
It depends on the circumstances. I mean, if the bank actually submitted it and got an acceptance, then you should not have lost your place in line. But if they didn't, and we've seen a couple of banks that didn't, they sat on it for a couple of weeks because something didn't reconcile within their system, and they just set it aside. And therefore they didn't even get a place in line because they never got their application submitted to the SBA. So it does depends on the circumstances.
Got it. So you need to ask. So, all right. So here's a couple of questions. So from Irma, she said the larger banks are very difficult to get in touch with. She's just sitting and waiting and waiting. Does she have to wait on the big bank? So if she's already submitted her application, she's in, and you just have to wait to see what happens, correct?
If your application, if it has been submitted to the SBA by that bank, you cannot submit another application with another bank.
Jennifer, can you clarify, Jen Cook, my bank is not allowing us to come in. What does that mean? You mean you can't talk to them? They're not letting you in the lobby, the drive-up window?
Yeah, I went to 2 different Chase banks, and they just allow you to go into the ATM, and there were no people in Chappaqua in the bank the past few times I've gone there, so I couldn't even talk to anybody about it.
So some banks have drive-up windows. Chase happens to have a drive-up window in the Stanford branch, so that may be one suggestion. Chris or Jason, any suggestions on that in terms of just finding out where you are in terms of feedback from the bank?
If you have a branch that you've done your banking with, you may try to find out who the branch manager is. The branch manager is usually, somebody who's there for the local businesses and individuals, and so that's usually a best focal point. If you don't have an existing loan, a lot of companies may have an existing loan with a bank, and they're just going to that bank officer who's their loan officer. But if you don't have that, you may want to try a branch manager for the local branch, and see if you can get through them by telephone or email.
Okay, good suggestion. All right, from Ingrid Harrison, she wants to know whether or not you've heard anything about processing loans specifically for women in business and minorities. Are there any allocations at this point made? I haven't heard of any. Chris,
That's
Jason.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because the CARES Act itself specifically sort of instructs the lenders to place a priority on lending for women and minority-owned businesses. That said, it was a guidance and not a rule. We haven't heard, perhaps Chris has, but I haven't heard of anybody in particular either getting a preference or actually getting a disbursement on a loan that they applied for.
Actually, excuse me, I asked the question, Headco, if you've ever heard of Headco, offered a loan for women in business and minorities, and I did apply for it.
Oh, okay. So that's outside of the CARES Act itself.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's interesting because, one thing we're seeing, if you look at the universe of available opportunities, it's not just the PPP loan. There's various state level loans and also private business loans that are available. We're waiting to see that really great website that sort of collects all of those possible opportunities. And if we find that, we'll put a link on and bounce it from our website so everybody can take a look.
Great, thanks, Jason. Another question we have, Jen is the only one on payroll. So she's the owner and on payroll. She also, is she eligible then as the owner and employee?
Yes, I mean, if you're all your other people that are working in the business are independent contractors, you cannot apply for them. You can only apply for yourself. Now, if you're the owner, you may be, if you're the sole owner of the business, you may be a sole proprietor who files a Schedule C, and then you're filing a sole proprietor as opposed to a corporation where you're the president of the company and you get a W-2. It's just a different form of filing as opposed to a different amount that you would get reimbursed. But it depends on how you're treated tax purposes as a sole proprietor, partner, or employee.
So I have two businesses. So I have the Foodie Bus and then I have the Chappaqua Wellness Center. One's a corporation, the Foodie Bus, and then I'm sole proprietor for the Wellness Center. But obviously I can't apply for both, right?
Yeah, that's a tricky situation that I don't think they've really covered because say you spend 50% of your time in each and you're making 50% of your income in each, you can only apply once. Now, technically, if you're in a corporation, you're applying on behalf of the corporation and you're an employee of that corp, whereas you're a sole proprietor in the other business. So it depends. If your entire compensation exceeds 100,000, you're going to still be limited to that 100,000. If it's less than 100, it's sort of an interesting question as to whether you can apply for the corporation with you as the employee, sole employee, and for the other business that may be treated as a Schedule C, as a sole proprietor, you can separately, because it was technically two different organizations. That's something I just don't know off the top of my head.
Right. So if I have already applied for the SBA, which I did personally, then I can't do anything about the corporation at this point, right?
Well, it's closed. So once we come out with new funds, what do you think then, Chris? Could she apply as the corporation at that point?
I think it's worth looking into, and again, usually most banks have an SBA loan officer, a person who only does SBA loans, and getting that to that person and being able to ask that question, interesting enough, at least the banks are able to get to the SBA and ask them certain questions. But I don't know how easy it is directly. That's something to ask your loan officer at the bank that you deal with to see, if you can apply in both different capacities. Because technically they are different. It's not, you cannot apply twice, but you applying as a sole proprietor is different than the corporation applying as a company. So technically it may work. I just don't know if they are putting out any guidance. They certainly haven't put out any guidance on that so far, but as to how they would consider that.
Okay, thank you.
then we have another question from Suzanne Tufts. What about independent contractors? In New York State, you don't have to go to the Secretary of State and actually register. Yet the application requires it. So what happens in terms of how that can be handled? How should that be handled?
I mean, filing as an independent contractor, not a state filing? Or, I'm not sure what the question
Suzanne,
is.
you want to chime in?
Yeah, what it is you had to get the starting date of your business, and there's a notation that says that's the date. I mean, I applied through lendio.com because I found my bank, one of the big banks, of which I'm a private client, but nevertheless impossible to work with. So on at least the Lendio application, they want your starting date of your business, and there's a notation that it has to be the same as the date you registered as your start date with your state Secretary of State's office, which does not apply to, gig economy, freelancers, independent contractors. And yet my application, for other reasons as well, keeps getting bounced back because you must answer that. I'm a little bit uncomfortable answering that and then swearing to, the honesty of the answer when there's no, I know what the start date was, but there's no registration.
So you're an unincorporated sole proprietor?
That's right. I'm just an independent contractor.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. Again, is like, there's a bunch of square boxes, and if you don't have square pegs to fit in them, they
Right.
create problems. I mean, it would technically be not applicable there, and if it kicks your application out, then that should be more the bank being able to handle that and be able to overcome that. But
Yeah.
it sounds like you're just subject to a very automated process.
Yeah, there's also one, I don't know if you've seen this, it's a question I asked. In a program such as this, Lendio's CEO is saying that due to a glitch in the SBA, its own computer files, anyone whose EIN or social started with 0, the computers read that 0 as there is no answer. And so it kept being bumped back from the SBA as incomplete. And it drove, Lendio crazy because they had already knew that it was complete. They had passed on those things. So they did an analysis of, their thousands and thousands of submissions. And that was one of the things that came up with in some ridiculously high percentage, but they say that is fixed now. So I guess it maybe doesn't apply to other people here, but nevertheless, any of us who got bounced back because of a 0 starting EIN or social, got bounced back and are, now having to wait for the second tranche or second round. So,
Yeah.
All right, we're happy to help afterwards with, very specific questions. If you'd like, I can provide the email addresses. I'll put in the chat for Chris and Jason, and happy to help. But I want to just address 2 more things. Do you have to hire the same employee in order to get the forgiveness? Jason, you want to take that?
So the short answer is no, you do not. The concept there is to just rehire. So it doesn't have to be the same exact person.
Okay. And then what documentation do you have to provide for forgiveness in the short story?
So, that's actually a great question. It probably should be one of if you could take away just a couple of thoughts from today's talk, it would be the documentation. So forgiveness, obviously the critical piece here is to get the forgiveness, right? So our instruction there is document, document, document. So to the extent you're looking at the payroll costs, you want to make sure you're documenting your paychecks, right? Your payments to the IRS or the state authorities, et cetera. Have that all written down. No different with respect to any other of the non-payroll costs. So document payments of the mortgage interest. If you have rent payments going out, document those checks to the landlord, utility checks, just the same you would good corporate good bookkeeping practices. The same will apply with respect to the forgiveness, and that will be reviewed. Since we're on that point, just know at the end of the 8-week period, you'll then take your time to gather all the documentation that your lender asks for, including the documentation I just mentioned. bear in mind your particular lender might have additional documentation requests, and also the SBA sort of reserves right to ask for any sort of follow-up questions with respect to the foregoing.
And the
once
key
you
is,
do, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
no, and the key is actually incurring those expenses in the 8 weeks from the date of the loan being dispersed. So just bearing in mind that, when you make rent payments, when you make, the payroll is pretty straightforward, because if you have payroll, you're obligated by law to pay it at certain times. So it's the expenses that, like health insurance, you don't want to delay on the payment of health insurance. You want to make sure you make that payment within 8 weeks. And then, and this is something that's not very well known, is it's not like at the end of the 8 weeks there's forgiveness. There's a period of time for the bank to review that, and the forgiveness isn't until 6 months after the loan disbursement. So technically, you'll between 8 weeks and 6 months, you still owe those funds, and the bank has an opportunity to review what should be forgiven, and so that process will take a few months' time. So it doesn't happen at the end of 8 weeks.
Got it.
It's an interesting point that Chris raises, because nobody's proven it out yet. But if you look at sort of the math here and the timing, as a technical matter, if you had your 8 weeks worth of payments, you documented and submitted that to your lender, the lender then by statute has 60 days or less to approve or deny your application. If that sort of works out, you would reach a period of time where the loan would be forgiven, yet you would not owe that first payment of interest or principal following the 6-month deferral. So it'll be interesting to see how that actually shakes out. And bear in mind, I'm just referring to the piece of the loan that's forgivable. So to the extent you're looking at 100% forgiveness, it may very well be that you make it through this being a true grant and you don't wind up on the hook making any payments at all.
Okay, I'm gonna end it here because we did promise to be 30 minutes. I put Jason and Chris's email in the chat, so feel free to record that. You can save the chat if you'd like. There's a little 3 dots on the lower side and lets you save the chat if you want to do that. And then Aria Anatopoulos, sorry, I've mangled her last name. She's on the call. She's their head of marketing. Martin has put out some great white papers. They have an FAQ, frequently asked questions, that they can shoot to you. They're also on their website. So if you'd like that, I put Aria's email address in the chat as well. So reach out to her if you'd like any of the materials or like to be on their mailing list. And I want to thank everybody for attending. Please feel free to email us. I'll throw my email in here as well. And feel free, I'm happy to make introductions. I have a great circle of bankers, as well as CPAs if you need better tax advice. And Martin is here, of course, to help you with any of your legal needs. So thank you very much, Chris and Jason. Thanks, Will Malpica, for putting this together. Any closing comments quickly? Either one of you want to add?
Oh, Kathy?
Yes.
Diane Ryder. I'm just wondering who I would ask about, are they extending health insurance benefits? I have Cigna, and it just seems a shame. My job just ended, and I'm paying $700 a month, and my Cigna is ending, my health insurance is ending in 10 days. Now, I just called about my mammogram, which is scheduled for a week from today. And first they said, no, we're putting it off till June. Then when I explained the situation, they said, okay, we'll do it. I was going to call Cigna and see, it just seems a shame that I can't really use the health plan. I don't have coronavirus. If you don't have, it seems like you can't really go to a doctor, and yet they're taking $700 out of my paycheck, which, now I'm unemployed. I get a W-2. So, but does anyone have any information about that?
Oh, just like Chris?
Is there, so did you just get laid off?
Yeah, like last week, the 15th, but I knew about it ahead of time. It had nothing to do with Corona. My assignment ended. They didn't renew a bunch of us. So I'll be collecting out of New York State, and I expect that to go pretty smoothly. But
well, in federal law, you have the right to COBRA continuation coverage.
Yes, but I'm not going to be able to afford that. There's no way. If I'm paying $700 a month now and I'm, receiving unemployment plus the stimulus, it's not, I can't afford that. It'll probably be $1,400. I also looked into the other thing, the marketplace. I have a broker that I know that would be $900. So I'm just asking, I'm going to call Cigna today. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through, but it just seems unfair that with people not being able to use the plans, I'm paying $700 a month. My company's taking out, and I haven't been able to use it for the last 2 months.
Why don't you email me later? I put my email in the thing. Please feel free. I want to keep this tight. We're at 12:35.
Okay.
I may have a solution, or I can direct you to somebody who can explain it to you and perhaps give you some more help.
Okay,
Because
thanks.
that's, I think, beyond the scope of what we're trying to accomplish today. So I want to thank everybody for attending. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jason, for putting this together. Have a great day, and feel free to email any of us for any kind of help that you'd like. We're happy to reach out and do what we can. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good
Thank
day.
you very much. Thank you, Kathy.
You're welcome.